The Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We also welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website and the C-SPAN network this morning. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And for those watching online, you are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Welcoming our guest and introducing our program is Dr. Kim Holmes, who is our acting Senior Vice President for Research. He previously served Heritage as Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies and Director of our Davis Institute. He is a founding editor of the annual Index of Economic Freedom, which has become a signature Heritage publication. From 2002 to 2005, he served in the George W. Bush administration as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kim Holmes. Kim?
Thank you. Yes, 3 minutes. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here and to welcome our distinguished guests to talk about the refugee policy. We just recently were refurbishing this room, and so you are one of the first guests to be able to see how it turned out. The United States Refugee Admission Program has been, as all of you know, the subject of significant discussion and legal battles in the last year. Of course, some of these legal battles have actually ended up in the Supreme Court, which will hear arguments this fall. By the end of September, the Trump administration should also determine how many refugees will be admitted for the next year. And these events and these issues have evoked strong emotions on all sides of this debate. With the refugee program in the news, how should the U.S. policymakers be thinking about this approach is a question on a lot of people's minds. I think the first step is to consider how this program impacts U.S. national interests. The refugee program touches many aspects of it, of homeland security, of foreign policy, economic vitality, and fiscal costs, and of course the question of immigrants in the United States. To see how the refugee program affects these interests, an assessment of its strengths, of its benefits, of its costs and its strengths and its weaknesses, we think is needed. Too often, the studies and the experts have looked at this question from just one point of view. And so we have here many points of view represented today, and we think that this is one of the best ways to look at all sides of the issue so all of us can make a rational decision about what should be done. From this point of view, I think that it's important that we do have an open debate how this works and how it can serve U.S. interests and how it can be reformed for the better, because there are aspects of it that perhaps we should be keeping and certainly some that should be changed. And that is, of course, the purpose of this panel, is to have this free and open discussion. We have many distinguished speakers here this morning. The first is Lawrence Bartlett. He is a career member of the Senior Executive Service and serves as Director of the Refugee Admissions Office of the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Populations, Refugees, and Migration. He leads the State Department's programs abroad and in the United States that identify and process and receive refugees for permanent resettlement in the United States. We also have Larry Yunk, who is the Senior Resettlement Officer for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for their regional office in Washington. He's been involved in refugee work since 1980. He became a caseworker for the International Rescue Committee and later worked with the Catholic Charities of Washington. Prior to joining UNHCR, he was with Georgetown University, and he has been with UNHCR since 1987, and he currently heads its resettlement unit here in Washington. Joe Cassidy is also a speaker here this morning. He is a global fellow and former fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he explored potential reforms for international humanitarian systems, including the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. He was previously a State Department diplomat, and he served in the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and South America. And he's also worked on the National Security Council staff and with the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Also, who will be moderating the panel is Heritage Foundation's Josh Maservi. He is a senior policy analyst for Africa and the Middle East. He served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia. Then he worked for Church World Services, a refugee settlement operation that was based out of Nairobi. He has worked as a U.S. Army Special Operations Command and also at the Atlantic Council, Atlantic Council's Africa Center before he joined the Heritage Foundation. Before I turn it over to Joshua, just a couple of points. All of the panelists will be available for interviews except for Lawrence Bartlett. Also, we like to remind you while I have the floor that Heritage Foundation has done a lot of research on this issue. In July, there was a backgrounder entitled The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, a Roadmap for Reform, that was authored by Olivia Enos, David and Sarah, and by Joshua Maservi. And also, David and Sarah, I believe, has a paper coming out this week, if it's available outside, on the whole question of quotas and the refugee programs. So we've done a lot of research, and without any further ado, first of all, I want to thank you once again for coming, gentlemen, and I'll turn it over to Joshua, who will now invite our first speaker to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Appreciate it. Larry, just want to get us started?
Sure, happy to do that. And just one point, although I'm happy to take press because we have kind of an authorization process for that, if there are requests for the Department of State, we would certainly take those and get back to the press on those issues. So first of all, I'd like to say, thank the Heritage Foundation for inviting me and for the report that they've issued on the program. I think it, first of all, I thought it was very well done, very comprehensive. I think I couldn't say that we would agree with every single point in the report, but I think it was very balanced in terms of the issues that are facing the program today. And certainly the need, I think, to look at some of those issues and to see how they can be improved. It's something that we've been doing, I think, since the program started, was really looking to see how it needs to be adjusted, improved, revamped, to really both serve the interests of the American people, as well as to serve the refugee clients that we work with. And so again, we welcome all input, and I think this was, in fact, a very good and comprehensive report. So a couple of things. I was asked to speak a little bit about the State Department's role and kind of how the process works. And again, I think the report actually did a very good job of putting that to words as well, but I'll go over some of those things. And then a little bit about the discussion that's happening right now within the administration about where the program is headed over the next few years. So again, I think the report did a good job really talking about resettlement as a very small tool that's used and really has to be used judiciously, because the vast majority, 99% of the refugees in the world, never have an opportunity to be resettled. So it's an incumbent upon us as a resettlement country, it's incumbent upon UNHCR to use this tool correctly. One of the debates that's happening now, or discussions is happening, is like, who should those refugees be? Who should be, I'll say, the lucky person who has the opportunity to be resettled, either to the U.S. or to one of the other 29 countries in the world that resettle refugees. And so what we have done in our program is really look at vulnerability and look at those people who, even in a country of first asylum like Jordan, a Syrian in Jordan, is not doing well, is in a precarious situation and needs a more permanent solution. So that's one way to look at it. Another is to look at refugees who are in protracted situations. And again, we've been doing some studies on behalf of the administration over the last few months. And one of the interesting facts that's come out is that now the average protracted situation for a refugee is 26 years. And while it's true they can tread water for 26 years, there are still people within that population who will not thrive and perhaps not even survive. So we're trying to look at those populations to see how we use this tool. One of the things we're not doing, but again, it's a point of discussion, is to really look hard at who's the best person in terms of assimilation. And I know the report talks about this in a bit, but we're primarily using this as a humanitarian tool coupled with foreign policy interests. So again, trying to alleviate or relieve Jordan of some of the refugees that they're currently hosting, we see as an important foreign policy tool and certainly an important piece of our bilateral relationship with Jordan. And it plays into the overall interest that we have in common with the Jordans of this world, with the Turkeys of this world, with the Kenyas of this world. And it's a tool that we can use and have used effectively to make sure that borders remain open to the extent possible, that people are not forcibly removed from countries, by showing and demonstrating U.S. support for that hosting country. So looking at and pivoting to assimilation for a minute, we want to primarily look at vulnerabilities, but then we want to take into account what do we need to do to help people assimilate. And I think, again, this has been a topic of discussion, not just recently, but for some time. There are tools that we have. There is federal funding that we provide. And it's not just the Department of State, it's also Health and Human Services, it's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, to help people not just make this transition, and not just to find gainful employment and become self-sufficient, but to really adapt to this new country. And so English language is one component, but also looking at how communities work together. And again, I think the report was very good in the sense that we don't expect people to become, we want people to become an American. We certainly want them to adjust status and become a citizen, but trying to define what that is in terms of American in such a complex and I think society that we have with all different ethnic groups and people from different backgrounds is an interesting question and probably open for debate, but it's one of the things that the current administration is really interested in. And so we've already been having discussions at pretty high levels about what additional programs we can provide to help people make this transition. The idea is that they have a limited amount of federal support to make the transition. It usually only goes up to about 8 months. People do have access to other programs that other Americans might have access to. But for the most part, we want them to take this opportunity, and for the most part they do, to have a new opportunity for life, for their families, for their kids. We see, and some of this is more anecdotal than we would like, that refugees do very, very well. And it's one of the reasons that we would like to see more long-term studies about refugee success and perhaps failure so that we can see really where are those areas that we should focus on more. John, are you going to time me? Because I'm. I will ramble if I. So,
Okay.
So just a
Couple
couple.
more minutes.
Let me make a few more points. So again, I think this election is really critical. It's one of the things that we're looking at, and also once we've selected people, because the most vulnerable are not always the most uneducated. And again, when we say certain populations, and I think Iraqis are probably the model for this, where people were highly educated, but then they have their own difficulties in making the adjustment to their professional life in the U.S. And part of it is the U.S. credentialing system, some of its language. So that's one of the things that HHS has been looking at to really see how can we promote those people to find jobs within their field. If not as a medical doctor right away, how can you gradually make that transition back into the medical profession? But the other piece that we've seen, I think, great success in is that refugees who by and large have not had a lot of access in their children to education for some years, or have not had access to legal work for many years, especially in their profession, oftentimes take very entry-level jobs in the U.S. And we've been working really hard for some years with employers to make that possible and to help people transition through some kind of a career ladder to higher levels of employment. So it's pretty traditional that the hotel industry, the meatpacking plants, other entry-level jobs have been widely open to refugees. And in fact, refugees really aren't competing with Americans for many of these jobs. They're taking jobs that are otherwise unfilled. And so again, and refugees frankly do quite well. And we've been even petitioned by some industry to resettle more refugees in their locations because they find refugees to be such good workers. Maybe I'll just speak a couple things in terms of the current administration reviews and priorities. One is refugee vetting. I think everybody knows that we're now under 120-day suspension on arrivals. There's a small cadre of people who have a bona fide relationship who are still allowed to enter. But for the most part, refugees are halted until close to the end of October. And we've taken this 120-day period to review the security vetting procedures that are currently in place. We're working, State Department, Department of Homeland Security is working very closely with the vetting partners, so the FBI, National Counterterrorism Center, others who actually perform the vetting to really see how those can be improved. The report correctly notes that refugees are the most highly vetted immigrant coming to the United States. That has been borne out by the current administration as we've been doing these reviews, but we still want to see where can improvements be made because we know that there will be vulnerabilities and we need to try to close those vulnerabilities as we can. So the vetting review is really key. We have also been tasked with doing cost studies on what does it cost to resettle refugees to the U.S. and how does that compare to the cost of providing assistance overseas. Those studies are not yet finished. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking at improvements to assimilation programs. And so each of the agencies, both State Department, Health and Human Services, as well as Department of Homeland Security, are looking to see what we can do to improve that. And then I think the ongoing question right now is really what will the size of the program be this next year? So this year the President capped arrivals at 50,000. And so there is now discussion, as was noted earlier, about what the program will be next year. And that decision has not yet been made, but we do expect it to be made before the end of September. I think I would leave it at that and turn it back to Josh.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Josh, and thanks to Heritage for the opportunity to be here today on behalf of UNHCR. It's also want to say thank you for the report. I would share Larry's comments. I thought it was a well-done report and provided a number of interesting items for discussion. And I think I'd like to focus on my talk towards the end on particularly some of the areas where I think we find a lot of common ground. I've been asked to talk about the international aspect of the resettlement process and refugees. So let me do that and sort of then end up with some reflections on the report, more specifically. For those who don't know us, well, UNHCR is the UN's refugee agency. Our main job around the world is to provide protection and assistance and to help find durable solutions for refugees. We're primarily a field-based organization. Places like Washington are a little bit of an exception to the rule. UNHCR staff are serving in many areas of conflict, and we're often serving on both sides of the line. So if you take a look at Syria, we're in Syria, and we're also working with Syrian refugees. So it's a delicate diplomatic dance that we have to do to make sure that we're there to assist persons in need. Currently, we're in 130 countries. We don't do our work alone. We work with other governments, host governments, sponsoring governments like the United States to provide funding and other assistance. UN partners like the World Food Program, who are a key international organization in migration. We work with NGOs, the Red Cross, and others. We work in various modes. So at the moment, you've probably seen in the news the Rohingya going into Bangladesh. And so we're often called to go in emergency circumstances. We work in sort of near to midterm refugee situations where refugees may be for 5 to 10 years. But we're also engaged with refugees, as Larry mentioned, that certain refugee populations that are now 20 and 30 years being refugees as well. All of these activities generally are done, have to be done in cooperation with host governments. Our estimate for the number of refugees that are under UNHCR's mandate, and this doesn't include the Palestinians who are under a different agency's mandate, for us is 17.5 million refugees, and they're part of a displaced population around the world, forcibly displaced, of about 65 million persons, and that includes internally displaced, stateless persons, as well as the Palestinians under the UNRWA agreement. As far as resettlement and UNHCR's role, resettlement also is, I would say, an important, but in terms of scale, not the largest of our activities when you take a look at assistance and protection. The real challenge for UNHCR, our work, is to identify people who we think have these heightened vulnerabilities, heightened needs relative to the other refugees out of that 17.5 million people, and do that in a way that's efficient and meets the needs of resettlement countries and serves, obviously, the refugees, but also, in many cases, also provides some sort of benefit to host countries who are often hosting massive numbers of refugees. In September of last year, there was a meeting at the UN General Assembly, the summit that focused specifically on resettlement and trying to encourage a more robust global response to the resettlement needs at that time. And I think we continue to hold out that about 10% of the world's refugees probably should be resettled. That would be about 1.7 million refugees would be the estimate of need. And countries were urged to increase their resettlement quotas, those who had programs, and new countries to step forward and join the resettlement groups. And I'm happy to say we're now up to, with the latest statistics, 31 countries involved in resettlement. So we did see some increases last year. I think the most notable upswing responses were in Europe, where I think UNHCR has been pushing for some time for the Europeans to step forward and take more individuals. At the same time, I will note Europe's also hosting many direct asylum seekers as well, so sometimes that's a little bit of a tough sell in Europe, but they have increased numbers. But if you take the total number of offered slots from the US, Canada, Australia, the European countries, New Zealand, and a couple of countries, several countries in South America, it really still only adds up to about a 5 to 8% range of being able to respond to the total refugee need. So that's really what we're trying to do, is to look through, that 1.7 million need to, to be able to address about 5 to 8% of those. So our second job beyond initial identification will then be prioritize who it is who will be put forward and to which countries. Clearly, there's still a need for us, and it's something that's going to continue as advocacy for UNHCR to get countries to join in doing resettlement, to look at other alternative solutions that countries might provide, with it, as long as they provide protection and the kind of security that resettlement does, and to also encourage countries to continue to maintain resettlement capacity, and particularly, again, traditional countries like the United States or Canada and Australia, who are vital to resettlement. For our role vis-a-vis a resettlement country directly, when we're making, I think it's always important to understand that UNHCR's role is really only to identify and present cases to countries. There is no country, including the United States, where we can make that country resettle someone. We work with countries to decide what kind of information needs to be presented for the cases to be adjudicated, but ultimately countries are sovereign. They make the decision on who it will or will not be resettled. We cannot compel any country to take refugees. There is no international obligation to resettle refugees, as the report says, in the same way that there is by signing the Refugee Convention, obligations to consider asylum seeker applications. But on resettlement, it is a voluntary activity. But I think it's a very important voluntary activity because I think in one sense, providing funding is one way to show support for internationally for refugees. Giving money is one thing, but providing actual resettlement places provides a separate and more visible way, even though it's a small number, of support, particularly for those countries hosting millions of refugees. I think it'd be fair to say that next to taxes, probably immigration is the most complicated thing that most people would ever have to deal with. And fortunately, there aren't too much intersection yet between taxes and refugees that I'm seeing. But resettlement is a complex involving both the overseas component, where many actors involved, as well as on the domestic side. In recent years, certainly one overarching element on both of those sides are issues of security and fraud, and every player in the system, including UNHCR, has had to become better at preventing fraud, identifying fraud, and dealing with fraud and misrepresentation in the program. One area UNHCR has invested heavily in is in biometrics. Biometric registration is now the norm for UNHCR. At this point, we have about 4 million people registered in one of our two biometric systems. One is an iris scan system, which is used principally with Syrians. And at this point, 99% of the Syrians registered with UNHCR are registered with iris scans. And the other is the Biometric Information Management System. It is the UN, so we have to have long acronyms. It's known as BIMS. And that is going to be our new standard, and that's what's being currently rolled out in Africa and Asia. And this will include iris scans as well as fingerprint collection. At this point, we now have 48 countries with operational biometrics as part of the registration systems, and over 4 million individuals enrolled. I will just quickly add that one of the key elements for having biometrics is when you hear that refugees are going to be refugees for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it's being able to lock down at the earliest possible point the identity a person is giving us and claiming, and that there's continuity and traceability in that identity. Our goal is to have 75 countries, which is virtually almost all of our major operations, with biometric capacity by 2020. I would mention that we have initiated with the State Department and Department of Homeland Security already a system whereby the U.S. has access to our Iris Guard database for Syrians as part of the fraud control measures for the Syrian program. Briefly on statistics, so far through the first half of the year, I'm sorry I don't have the last month, we have 45,000 individuals referred for resettlement during the first half of the year. That's down somewhat from last year. About 50% of the submissions are to Europe, 40% to the U.S., and the remainder Australia, Canada, and the other countries. And finishing up quickly, just a few reactions to the report, which again, I think UNHCR welcomes this report and thinks that it's well documented and well argued. Like Larry and State Department, there are probably areas where we wouldn't be in complete agreement, not surprisingly, but I think that there are many areas where we do share the views of the report in principle or in specifics. We appreciate the report's really commitment to try to find a way to keep a sustainable program going in the United States, and one that's safe and secure. We share the view, as the numbers bear out, that resettlement is not the option for most refugees. 99.5% of refugees will not be resettled. So, and UNHCR does not have a position on the right of free right of migration. We are involved actually in a system of legal migration, following very specific rules and working with countries under those rules. Certainly, the report's emphasis on the need to improve and constantly monitor integrity of the program, and as Larry said, to make sure that we don't have precious places being used by people who don't deserve to be resettled, that should not be in the system, who are taking away from other people who should be resettled, is paramount to us. It's like having a rare and a limited drug that can provide a great healing and giving it to the wrong people. That would be a waste. And so we share that we have to make sure that these numbers go to the correct people. I've mentioned that the biometrics and new databases we put out. I would just mention that in the report, these are actually interconnected at this point. So when you do check biometrics in one country, you will be checking them with all countries in UNHCR at this point in a real-time operation. Finally, although UNHCR is not directly involved in the domestic side with what happens to refugees when they arrive in the United States, we certainly share globally an interest with all resettlement countries of having more information about outcomes of resettlement and more measurements, benchmarks, to use the old Ed Koch, how we doing? Are we doing well or not? And both from the refugee standpoint, but also from the communities receiving refugees, because in the long run, that's the sustainability of the program. So we would welcome, not just from the U.S., but from all countries, because I think it's not unique to the U.S., a more systematic and regular reporting back, because it will help us manage our programs to know if we're making correct decisions, if there's anything we can do on our side overseas to make the programs run better. But in order to do that, we need proper research, independent, neutral, I think, research that gets out into communities and gives us really good feedback. So with that, I'll just say, again, thank you for the opportunity. We do have some comments on the report, but I hope in the Q's and A's that we could get into some of those more. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Larry.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Thanks very much to Heritage for putting the panel together. Always a pleasure to be with Larry and Larry, which I'm now going to refer to as Larry Squared, since I said a lot of the same things this morning. So let me start by joining in congratulations for these guys, for Josh, Olivia, and David. Put together a really nice report, and it's obviously very timely. It's nuanced and carefully argued in a way that's not always common on these issues right now. So as you all know, the debate over refugee issues seems to be marked by the extremes right now. And I think what the Heritage Report does very well is it reminds us of a separate debate, a more interesting debate among experts who may not agree on all the specifics, but who acknowledge that there's a need for reform of the resettlement system and are looking for the right answers. So kudos to all three of you. I really appreciate your work. So I've been asked to focus on assimilation, which is something I've written about a good bit. And I will start by saying I was really happy that the Heritage Report identifies assimilation as one of the three key takeaways, and that the other two key takeaways, overall systemic reform and the need to identify sort of the best, most capable candidates for settlement, that those are directly relevant to assimilation. So I think that's good news. Let me do a quick sidetrack on nomenclature. As you all are aware, there's a spirited debate right now on refugee issues, and there are a lot of folks who talk about assimilation, there are a lot of folks who talk about integration, and there are a lot of folks on each side that use one word and refuse to use the other. So I will say I see those two terms as different but complementary, and I don't feel any need to choose between the two. So when you hear people talk about integration, generally what they're talking about is participation in economic and political structures. And when you hear people talk about assimilation, you tend to hear them talk about a consonance of civic values. Those are both goods, and I think we want to pursue both of those. So in my remarks this morning, I'm going to be talking about things that people commonly think of as either assimilation or integration. Okay, so what would an assimilation-centric refugee resettlement process look like, and how would it be different from the process we have right now? Let me take in turn the three phases, so pre-arrival phase, reception phase, and then the longer-term post-resettlement phase. First, in pre-arrival, I agree with the Heritage Report that there is some value in choosing candidates most likely to succeed in resettlement. I think there are sort of broader benefits that we can all understand from that, but I want to add two caveats. And the first is that it is not necessarily clear in the data that the most educated, most skilled refugees are the most successful in resettlement. So I think that's one point worth drilling down on. And then the second one is I think we need to make sure when we're talking about reform that we preserve space in the resettlement program for it to do the hardest work. So you've heard Larry and Larry talk about how the U.S. program in particular identifies people who are the most vulnerable. These people are generally not safe or won't be successful in their current situations. And I think a longtime hallmark of the U.S. program was that we would resettle these tough cases. And I think we need to preserve space for that. The Heritage Report also recommends that we, quote, ask refugees whether they plan to adhere to the laws and Constitution of the United States, unquote. And Americans generally are uneasy about the prospect of government-administered ideological tests, right? And we should be. I think we should be wary about that. But I can imagine some sort of a process that would address these values issues as part of the vetting process. It would have to be very carefully designed, but if well designed, I can imagine it doing a number of important things. One, weeding out security risks, or helping to at least. Two, reinforcing norms or expectations of conduct or behavior in our country. And also three, potentially dissuading those who are unwilling to accept those norms and conventions. But again, to wrap up, I think we need to be very careful about this idea. Whatever kind of values discussion we have with potential resettlement candidates, it would have to be nonpartisan, it would have to be non-sectarian, it would have to be universally applied, and it would have to steer clear of the constant constitutional debates that we have in this country already. We want to focus on core American issues and not get stuck into the more partisan issues. So turning to the reception phase, I think we need to do a much better job at preparing refugees for America. And to give you a sense, so I was a foreign service officer for a long time, spent a lot of time abroad, and every time I came back to the United States, even if it was after sort of a 2 or 3 year tour, I faced some element of culture shock, right? America, busy, complicated place, it's in your face, it moves fast. So I think we need to do a better job preparing refugees for the culture shock of America, especially because so many of them come from a context that's very different. So I think this training needs to start before they arrive. I think it needs to be more detailed than is currently the case, and I think it needs to be blunt about the challenges that they'll face in the United States, which we all know, but I think we need to have some honesty in that process. Second, I think we need to do a better job at skills and educational assessments on the ground. This is data that can be shared ultimately with American school systems to help their planning. It's data that can be shared with potential employers. It can be key to vocational training. The international community in general is not doing a very good job at assessing skills and attributes. Third thing here, civics education. I think we could do a lot, both pre-arrival and post-arrival, to teach people who are on the, on track to become new American citizens, to teach them basic civics. I think that would be useful. And then finally, English language training. There's no greater barrier toward integration into American communities and assimilation as an American than the ability to speak the language. So I think we need to do a better job there. And I think in terms of all these training aspects, I think that we could do a better job taking advantage of some of the online education resources out there. So as you guys know, over the last generation, huge revolution, Coursera, Khan Academy, you've got all these models of web-based education that I think we can tap into. Okay, and then turning to the post-resettlement phase, which is in some ways where I think we have the most work to do. So as Larry and Larry's remarks indicated, but I think we should say more explicitly, if we're looking to grade success or failure of resettlement, that's not, the grading period is not the first 3 months or the first year. The grading period is the first 5 years or the first decade or the first decade and a half. So I think we need to do a better job with long-term monitoring and support for people joining our communities. And this, by the way, would, I think, help address one of the concerns in the Heritage Report about, Generation 1.5. So younger people who don't have strong ties to their country of origin and may not be developing strong ties to their country of resettlement. So, so long-term monitoring support, I think we need to do a better job than we're doing right now working with local host communities. So these are all the people who have to provide the support for these resettled refugees. And this is local planners and government types, school, health, social worker, mental health administrators, local law enforcement. There's a whole series of characters out there, and I think we're not adequately looking at their needs in trying to facilitate the entry to America of these populations. I've written something, and by the way, I think this is, what I'm thinking of is a position that would be more broad than the current setup where HHS has Office of Resettlement, Refugee Resettlement regional coordinators. What I'm thinking of is a facility that would be able to coordinate all these disparate actors and also to stage or choreograph interventions as necessary. So as you'll understand, humans are complicated. We bang into each other a lot. So think about refugees who whose children may be having trouble at school, who may have disagreements with neighbors, who may, be fighting with the local zoning board, who maybe have workplace disagreements. These are the kind of things that are natural and human and normal, but it's much more difficult for a resettled refugee to solve these problems than it would be for an American citizen. So I think we need to do a better job at creating some facility to make these interventions, which, by the way, would go a great distance to preventing resentments and long-term alienation, which is something we will obviously want to avoid. Okay, and I'll just wrap up real quick. So I'm aware there's lots of long-term studies going on. I know UNHCR is doing a multi-city research project right now. I'm teaching a course up at Yale, and we're working in parallel with the UNHCR effort. PRM is doing work. There's some great work being done by cities and states to gather data. Urban Institute, I think, is out somewhere. So I think there's a lot going on, and what I would counsel is that all those data streams be brought together in an organized way. I think that would be useful in getting a full analysis of the program. So just in closing, I'll get up on my hobby horse and say that I don't think there's a more important element of refugee resettlement than this assimilation integration piece. It's key to the national security issues involved. It's key to economic prosperity issues, to political community issues, and it's key to our humanitarian values, including making sure that refugees resettled in the United States become success stories, which is what we all want. So I think we need to get it right, and I'm committed to working with these guys to find good answers. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. I'll throw it over to myself now. So I'm going to just run quickly through the highlights of this report that we've all been, or the other panelists have been talking about, and they've actually done a very good job of covering most of these topics, so there'll be hopefully not too much redundancy, but I wanted to start, though, by discussing the benefits that we found as we went through this process of studying the USRAP, the benefits of the system, or of the program, rather. And again, some of these have been touched on, but I'll run through them quickly anyways. So helping allies and partners, fairly obvious one, but it is meaningful. And I would suggest that even though we're frequently talking about a very few number, a very small number of refugees, resettlement does appear to have some sort of outsized impact as far as both the symbolism of it, but also how countries appreciate the United States and other countries resettling refugees out of their territory. One of the primary issues here is that frequently refugees wind up in countries that are themselves quite strained already and don't have the resources or have other existing issues that make it difficult for them to deal with large influxes of people. There are other ways to help refugees, of course. Resettlement is not our main effort, but it does appear to have somewhat of an outsized impact on these countries as we try to demonstrate our value of their partnership and help them as we can. A related note is resettlement strengthens U.S. public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is just the story we tell to the citizens of other countries. And a part of the U.S.'s influence on the international stage derives from our status as a moral actor, as a humane actor. That directly affects our ability to use our influence on the global stage. And this is something we can point to as one of the reasons why we should have moral standing. And so third point, this is a way for the U.S. to lead on foreign crises. I believe the world is a safer place when the U.S. is in a leadership position. Need to do it wisely, of course, but this is something that demonstrates U.S. engagement and leadership. Similarly, it gives a way for the U.S. to respond to intractable crises. So sometimes there are conflicts and problems throughout the world that the U.S. genuinely can't do much about. But resettlement is something that the U.S. can do in some of these situations. And finally, of course, the most obvious one is that resettlement does alleviate human suffering. The U.S. has a long tradition of humanitarian activity, and resettlement is in obvious keeping with that tradition. So the two major focuses of the paper ended up being the question of security, which most people, or in this current debate, most people are focused on, and then assimilation, as has already been talked about quite a bit. Refugees are as we've already heard, the most heavily vetted of all immigrants to the United States. It's a very complex process, and you can read more about it in the report. I won't belabor it here. Something else that we thought about as we looked at the vetting process, though, is that it's also a very long process, and resettlement in general is an uncertain process. So if you're a terrorist looking to gain access to the United States, this isn't a great option for you. One, your chances of being selected for resettlement are very small anyways. And then two, it's a quite long process, and you are being quite heavily scrutinized. So for those reasons, we think the security challenges associated with U.S. RIP are actually not as pronounced on the vetting side of things. But the reality is no vetting system can weed out all potential bad actors. Until we create a system that can see into the hearts and minds of those we're trying to vet, we're going to run that risk of someone getting through. There are improvements that we can make. We lay out a number of suggestions in the paper for how we think we can tighten up vetting. There are things that Citizenship and Immigration Services can do. Moving to what's called person-centric vetting, sort of a one-stop shop for all the information that the U.S. government has gathered on this person, make that more easily accessible and shareable, and then focus on best candidates for resettlement, which we've already discussed here, but particularly emphasizing credibility in that process. I think what was perhaps most striking for us when we looked at the related security issues here was that those people who came to the United States as refugees, who then later engaged in Islamist terrorist activity or related activity, the great majority of them radicalized here in the United States. It was very rare for someone to be resettled and then to immediately turn around and engage in this sort of activity. Many of them had been in the U.S. for a decade even or longer before they started engaging in terrorist-related activity. And this gets to what Joe referenced, this 1.5 generation challenge. We think of 1.5 as children who were resettled to the United States or to any third country really, as children, as young people, and grow up there and spend most of their formative years in those countries. Although also the second generation, the generation coming right after immigrants to a new country. This also appears to apply, but this 1.5 generation can somewhat can feel a bit unmoored, maybe is the best word, somewhat lost between two cultures and two worlds. They don't strongly identify with their parents' home country, which they might have no memories of, and they don't strongly identify possibly with their new country either. They're still very aware of their difference. And that, I don't want to draw direct causal links here because the literature doesn't support that yet. But there is a lot of correlation and an increasing amount of correlation between folks who radicalize and their membership in this 1.5 or second generation. And it's very much in keeping with the challenge the Europeans have had with domestic radicalization. Many of the cases that you see over there or many of the attacks are perpetrated by people from this 1.5 generation. So that sort of naturally led us into the second major focus of assimilation, and Joe did a very good job of unpacking this. And I think definitions are really important because it is a somewhat contested word, and people debate it. But we just simply define it as a superseding loyalty to fellow Americans, the U.S., and its values. Now, that's a little bit vague, but I think most of us would sort of inherently understand generally what we think of as American values, and we just we made a conscious decision to use the word assimilation because integration, the other word you frequently hear. We agree, like, integration is key, but assimilation, the values question to us appeared to be the most important part of this, and was the best predictor of refugee success. I think it stands to sort of obvious reason that if you have a deep affinity and love for the United States, you're not going to involve yourself in Islamist terrorist activity. That's terrorist rhetoric is frequently virulently anti-Western and anti-American, and you would recoil from that if you had a deep and abiding love for the U.S. But that's only one aspect, of course. That's just on the security side of things. There's also the issue of just the quality of life of refugees who come here, and the health of the overall society that's accepting them. And of course, the U.S. is famously a nation of immigrants. What distinguishes the U.S., I would argue, is this history of people coming here and adopting U.S. values and seeing themselves first as American, and that's been the glue that's held the country together throughout its years. Non-assimilation. There's negative consequences to non-assimilation, and again, we spoke about the radicalization part of it, but or that potential link, but it also seems that non-assimilation frequently leads to isolation from mainstream society. It can lead to the formation of enclaves that, and unfortunately our European friends have a few examples of this, where very negative outcomes for the people living there, higher unemployment, things of that nature. Assimilation is not the silver bullet, of course. You can have poverty, you can have crime, et cetera, even with assimilated people, but it seems clear that assimilation facilitates a happier and or higher quality of life. That's why, and assimilation, it's hard to measure. And thinking as policy, or thinking from a policy perspective, like how does a government official help someone assimilate? That's hard. And that's why most of our recommendations ended up focusing on civil society. And we think sort of non-government entities have a leading role to play in this challenge here. Bringing civic groups together, trying to rally them, and many of them are already involved in this process, but trying to bring them more deeply into the process of welcoming refugees and trying to bring them into the mainstream of society. We do think that the U.S. government needs to put together an assimilation strategy that affects all levels of the resettlement process. And we think it should look at ideas like private resettlement, which the Canadians do. So private resettlement is when private individuals can sponsor refugees to come to, in this case, Canada, and then they're essentially responsible for them for some period of time, usually a year, sometimes it can be longer. And refugees who've gone through that program report much higher satisfaction with their experience. Their outcomes are better, educational, income, things of that nature. And again, to us, that was another indication of how important it is to move refugees into mainstream of society as quickly as possible. As you know, as we've discussed on this panel, we can't take in huge numbers of refugees, and there's no indication that we're going to, and no country is. It's a very small percentage that will ever be resettled. We need to focus, as we're doing now, most of our money on where we can help the most refugees, and that is overseas. It's the most cost-effective way to help the largest number of refugees. But there are benefits to resettling some refugees, as we lay out in the paper, and for that reason, we think that the program, with some reforms, with implementing some of the suggestions that we've put forward, could be improved even further. And I'll just echo, I think everyone mentioned this one, which was gratifying, but we do need these long-term assessments of refugee outcomes. It was very frustrating to study this, and the best you could get was a report that gave some anecdotes, 5 years out. So we really need a systematic longitudinal survey that tracks refugee outcomes. That'll help policymakers hopefully formulate better policies that will benefit both the refugees and the U.S. in general. That brings us to the end of our sort of prepared remarks. We'll move right to Q&A. I'll give the normal caveats. If you have a question, do please make it a question. Pith is always valued. And you can either direct it to a specific individual or to the panel, and we'll divvy it up among ourselves. I think, sure. So, yeah, we have a microphone, so please wait for the microphone and identify yourself.
My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is that why do many white Americans are calling President Trump racist or bigot when all he is doing trying to not make America another England or another European country where you have explosion monthly, if not weekly. And I could give you my own example. I was in Pakistan and I was stopped on Dubai airport. I'm a Muslim, my name is Mohammed. And she interviewed me for like 45 minutes and she wanted to send me back to Pakistan. Sometimes they can interview you in Dubai rather than in New York. So I told her, listen, I have return ticket from Lahore to New York and New York to Lahore back. And I showed her email where Department of State had asked me in Islamabad that I should leave the country as soon as possible because my life is not safe there. I have nothing against this lady who wanted to send me. I asked her just a question. I said, have you realized that I've been in DC for more than 30 years and you were not even born. She was from Eastern Europe and she has a heavy accent. But somehow she felt mercy, whatever, she let me come to the state. And then I was interviewed. Then I applied for citizenship, and Miss William, if she were white, I would call her racist. She asked me, she said, I like you. She interviewed me 3 times. She told me, but I cannot give you citizenship. I have nothing against Miss William, because she asked me, why do police keep arresting you? I said, maybe I'm angry, impulsive, I'm loose cannon. So all these three people, the lady who interviewed me in Dubai airport, or this Miss William, who is biracial, and President Trump, they have nothing against me as a Muslim. They have nothing against Muslim. They just want to keep America a little different than Europeans have made themselves. They are very insecure. And I mean, I can understand
So
completely.
so could
Why
you
do
recap the
white
question?
people
Yeah.
calling President Trump racist, or whatever you call it, and bigot,
Right.
while he just want to keep the America safe?
Okay,
Thanks.
sure. Well, I can't speak for people who call him those sorts of things, and well, I've never called him a racist or a bigot. So yeah, it's politics, and people throw around charges that maybe they, upon later reflection, might regret or not. But it's just something I can't really speak to, honestly, because it's well outside my area of experience. So.
Josh, I also don't want to specifically speak to that, but there are a couple of things I heard in there that I would like to speak to, and one is, and I think it's been pointed out through this summer, I mean, the fact, and because I want to intersect that with the refugee resettlement program versus people who are seeking asylum, and especially in Europe, and some of the press, I think, that was happening in Europe over the summer, over the last year, about people arriving without proper security vetting. And you mentioned perhaps, in terms of travel, restrictions on travel of people. So, I think there's nothing that the U.S. government takes more seriously than making sure that people who arrive here, that we have a responsibility for arriving here through the resettlement program, have been security vetted prior to arrival. So again, I heard that. I know that wasn't your main theme, but I think that's an important point to make. Asylum seekers who show up on our doorstep, we have a responsibility to consider whether or not they have a refugee claim. We also have a responsibility to consider whether they're safe to be in the United States. But resettlement, sometimes we'll say offshore resettlement, those people who we are affirmatively bringing here must pass all of these tests to our level of satisfaction. They have no inherent right to come here. And so, again, when we have a concern, generally, in fact, always, those people will not arrive. So, that was one thing I did want to mention.
I think that point's well taken. The refugee resettlement program is very, very different from what's happening in Europe, where they do have millions of people coming in, which is an immense challenge to manage that number and to vet that number safely. The U.S. RAP is very different. This is a controlled, small program where there is heavy vetting and things of that nature. So,
Hey, Charlotte Cuthbertson from the Epoch Times. You all said that you really appreciated the report, but there were some parts of it that you didn't agree with. Could you specify some of those parts that you disagree with?
who wants to dive in?
Yeah, I'll let Larry go first.
I would say a couple of the things. One, in particular, although I think, as we've discussed it, maybe I've read it a little bit too strictly, but is taking cases only vulnerable and not necessarily people who've been in a refugee situation for a long time. An example would be the Bhutanese, who the U.S. has taken and who were in a camp for 15 years through multiple negotiations, after which Bhutan agreed to take back 3 out of 100,000. And the U.S. and other countries offered resettlement at that time. I think that was, while there was no imminent danger, while there were some dangers in the region, I wouldn't say, if looking at all refugees everywhere, that they would rise to what refugees in some other locations would run into. At the same time, you know, after 13 negotiations, trilateral, it was ruled out that Bhutan was ever going to take these people back. The Nepali government had expressed some interest in resettling some, but they don't, integrating some, but 100,000, no. So I do think there are times that looking at some of those other groups. And I also think the other element, just again on the assimilation side, is ensuring that you have a sustainable mix of refugees in, for example, families. So, for example, an elderly person might look on paper like not particularly able to integrate or assimilate easily, and yet that person may play an important role in the family in providing childcare so that the parents can go to work, or to provide, some of the guidance to those 1.5 generation. Because I think part of that what we see often is when we have, I think, large cohorts of young people, and I think the 1.5 generation coincides pretty much with where there's a lot of problems with people that are that age, whether they're refugees or not. If you look at crimes and some of the things in the news. So having, and particularly in traditional groups where elders play a role in sort of setting the norms for the community and such, I think being a little bit mindful of making sure that we have the right mix. The final thing I would just mention, because I run into this with other countries, not the U.S. so much, is if you take all just vulnerable cases, you end up with a fairly big lift on all your cases if everybody is tortured, medically needy, et cetera. So having a bit broader mix sometimes also, I think, provides for a more sustainable community, because you'll have people who are able to work and such. So for us, it's always as we're trying to do, looking at who needs resettlement, those are things that run through our mind, because you do have to have sustainable family units, sustainable communities. That, you want functional, particularly for people who are coming out of very non-functional areas.
So I just want to add something on that, because we speak about the criteria of vulnerability as selection, and again, I mean, people come as families. Not everybody in the family has the same level of vulnerability. We have, since this program is used for foreign policy purposes as well, when we think about the case of the Bhutanese, arguably people weren't highly vulnerable. They were simply stuck forever in a frankly a stateless situation where their citizenship to Bhutan was not recognized, and Nepal would not welcome them as Nepali. They had been out of the country, frankly, for 100 years. So they were ethnic Nepali, but they were not Nepali. And so again, the idea that everybody is the most vulnerable and everybody has the same types of fragility or difficulties, I think is wrong. But again, I think part of our interest, and I think we share it with UNHCR, is to really look at vulnerability as one of the key factors that we consider. And again, I think it's an open question as to, again, what makes the best person in terms of assimilation, if that's going to be one of the criteria, and I would maintain it should not be the criteria. What are those factors that go into that, and how can we work through that issue in a way that I think still is a responsible way to look at the underpinnings of this program, which is based on humanitarian principles, based on foreign policy principles, but while still helping people make that movement to assimilation, make that movement to not just job security and economic security, but adopting American values. The one thing I would point out, and partly because it's one that keeps on coming up constantly, is when we work with UNHCR to identify refugees, sometimes we identify groups. And I know this report specifically suggested that we might identify victims of ISIS as a group. I think it's a bit of a, again, maybe just kind of a misnomer. We don't need to specify groups in order to address problems. And so victims of ISIS, whether they show up in Turkey, whether they're still inside Iraq, are identified by UNHCR and the international community as some of the most extremely vulnerable people in the world. And we do have a small-scale program with UNHCR to address some of those needs through resettlement. So we don't need to call them out as a group. That sometimes helps in terms of when it's a large number that we're resettling. But if we're looking at people self-identifying either as a religious minority or perhaps an ethnic minority, that creates fraud issues for the program, because sometimes people will then want to identify when that's not even true. And so again, it's part of our fraud mitigation strategy that we have UNHCR generally in the forefront of identification, locking in identities, as you heard, when people cross borders, which is at least 5 years before resettlement would ever be considered. And only at that time considering should that person be a candidate for international resettlement. So we try to lock in that group's identity as well as the individual vulnerabilities. And that's sometimes why I think having this group designation isn't helpful.
I have a question for Mr. Cassidy. You seem reluctant to see refugees ask ideological questions as to their values. As regards the laws of the United States, as all citizens are bound by the same laws, why do you see, or do you see, asking refugees whether they will obey those laws as a question?
Let me start by correcting you and say that I'm not reluctant. I guess where I come down on these issues is that we need to exercise great care. So I think, as I hope I said, and forgive me if this was not clear enough in my presentation, but I do think that we could incorporate more of the values discussion into that interaction with someone who's potentially a resettled refugee coming to the United States. But to say the obvious, in America, we have a lot of ongoing constitutional disputes right now. Right? There's a lack of unanimity on many of our major political questions. So I think that what we would need to do, what would be essential, is to focus on things that are core American values and avoid going down paths that could lead to sort of sectarian or partisan political interpretations of what those values are. I think one potential model, although before I throw this out, I'll say I have reservations about this too, but one potential model is the citizenship exam, which is constructed to try to avoid these current political disputes that we have right now, constitutional questions that are still open. It tries to avoid sectarian, partisan political views. I think that's the right way to go. I think that will, a process of engaging potential resettled refugees on those core American values is more likely to identify the candidates who will become the best resettlement candidates in the United States and ultimately the best fellow citizens for us as they move along the citizenship pipeline. So,
I had one thing.
Yeah.
One thing I would just add that I think it's often a little overlooked, and it was actually a thing I'd mentioned, is the Refugee Convention, besides the obligations of states, Article 2 is actually the obligation of refugees to the states that they're in, which is to follow the laws and regulations and to keep good public order in those states where they're recognized as refugees. So I think that there's actually an international legal principle to refer to as you look at doing this, because it's a requirement of being recognized as a refugee. Now, then, as Coach O is saying, defining what that is becomes a question, but there isn't a question that the refugee is, by being recognized, their part of the bargain is to agree to abide by the laws of the country that is recognizing them. And we go beyond that to keep good public order, which I think that when you do all the research on that, I mean, it's to beyond that, to be part of the community and to be, not causing problems. So I think that there is a basis for that, and I would say that there are countries that do have statements that people sign. But going back to Joe's point, you can sign a statement in a refugee camp and it won't mean anything. So you have to build something around that. Maybe signing the statement is the impetus to have the bigger discussions, like you're going to be signing a statement. This is what this is So, I mean, there is international precedent that UNHCR has worked with that, but to make it meaningful is the real challenge. You want people to understand it, not just sign a piece of paper.
Sure.
Hi, Nisi Hamilton with the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation. Thank you for this panel. I'm still confused about something kind of basic, has to do with the definition. Given that what we're seeing in the newspapers about refugees and that the populations of those refugees are people fleeing from places of war and instability and ISIS, but only ISIS among many other problems. I just want to know what our definition of refugee is. I mean, isn't it still based on the Immigration and National Immigration Act that it's a fear of persecution? And if so, why are we not using that as a metric as opposed to what I keep hearing you say is most vulnerable? I mean, are we morphing away from the old definition?
So let me give it a try. So no, so there's the definition of who is a refugee, and you have it right. It's a well-founded fear of persecution or past persecution. So it's either fearing it or having experienced it. And UNHCR has a responsibility on the international side, or frankly, the hosting government, so let's say Jordan in this case, has a responsibility for determining those people who are coming into their country, whether or not they are a refugee. And oftentimes UNHCR assists with that. When we resettle somebody to the U.S., an official from the Department of Homeland Security, so an American employee of Homeland Security, conducts the interview overseas for a person who's been referred to us, either via UNHCR or perhaps the U.S. Embassy, and does that, even though UNHCR has conferred initial refugee status on them, if you will, we do that again. And frankly, the U.S. definition is very, very similar to the UNHCR international definition, but that has to be adjudicated again, and a person has to be able to articulate an individual fear or past experience of persecution in order to qualify under U.S. law. So it is not just everybody who flees Syria is a refugee. That is done on an individual basis when we consider somebody for resettlement.
Can I add one more thing on that? At the Wilson Center, my colleagues and I have done some work to think through international law reform. So your question is, we could have another panel maybe on reform the Refugee Convention at some point, but your question is a good sort of arrow pointing at a broader question, which is whether the legal situation right now is correct. So as Larry said, 5 criteria in the Refugee Convention itself. Those are the basis for U.S. law and the determinations that we make. But the Refugee Convention dates from 1951, sort of different world then. There are protection categories that would normally be included in a human rights treaty if we were trying to organize one right now that are absent from the Refugee Convention. Give you an important one, gender is not there. And there are some things, there's a social group, and the construction and interpretation of that has been used more broadly to broaden this out. But there are lots of smart people thinking through what we would need to do to adjust international law to bring it up to speed now and deal with new situations, including, to throw one out on the table, the prospect that people may be forced to flee by sort of, global climate change, things like that are nowhere considered in the Refugee Convention. So your question is a good one. It's there's a lot of ferment right now, and I think to describe the parameters of that debate, I would say that humanitarians understand the weaknesses of international law and the things that are missing, but also want very much to make sure that if we do undertake a process of legal reform, that we would do it in a way that protects the protections that are currently in refugee law right now.
Maybe I would just say one thing about the vulnerability piece. UNHCR has the 17.5 million refugees, they're looking at vulnerability as to who they will refer. Once they refer those people to a government, and in this case ours, it's at that point that we will look again at whether or not they are a refugee. So the vulnerability is a component, but it's not, the overarching need is that they be a refugee. But then within that, we're looking to see who are those people we should resettle.
Yeah.
I'm Brigida Mulligan, and I'm a German legal immigrant. And my question that I'm going to ask can be answered by any of you. And I'm a product of a refugee from Russia, which was Poland, where my father was from. And this is from World War II. He went to West Germany and left Germany in 1956. So we immigrated to America, a family of 5. I was 7 years old. I became a U.S. citizen when I was 18. I'm very interested in this subject, and I know that you've talked about the fact there's so many refugees that need to be taken care of, and we can only take X number of percent. And I'm really upset that we can't take everybody in. It costs all of us a lot of money to do this, all of the countries that are trying. My question is, what can be done to solve the problem to keep having refugees that need a place to go? My thought is, gee, Dad, why couldn't you go back to your homeland? Couldn't something have been done where you could have gone back to your homeland instead of left your, the whole family left? They were refugees, came to Germany where families took them in, and then over a period of time applying for the immigration, we came to the United States and went through a lot of what you talked about, and was one of those successful families. My father, worked, my mother worked. They raised 6 children. I was the caretaker for 3 of them. But my real question is, what can we Americans do, or not just America, but all the other states, instead of trying to take 1% of the refugees in, what can we do? And I think of this of Mexico. What can we do to cause things to change so they all don't want to come here? We can't take them all in. So that's kind of my big question. Can we spend that money in a different manner? Could have something have been happened after World War II where my father could have gone back? Did you get my gist? Anyway, you can answer that. It's just
let me take a small stab, and then I'll let other people take one too. First of all, and the report I think was very good at highlighting the vast majority of U.S. taxpayer money, frankly, that is used for refugees is used overseas, and so. It's unfortunate that on the humanitarian side, our funding is basically used to help people who are waiting to go home. They're the people who were in West Germany hoping to go back to Poland or Russia someday when it becomes safe. And so on the humanitarian side, we're helping people wait until a time when it becomes safe. It's an unfortunate piece of the world right now where these conflicts are protracted, and I don't know anyone who's predicting when it will be safe to really go back to Syria. I mean, there are some parts of Syria that may be safe, but vast parts that are not. And so again, we just had this unfortunate situation where people are displaced. As it was noted, they're often displaced to countries that don't really have the economic means to provide support. They are not as well off as a place like the U.S. And so a Turkey, a Jordan, a Uganda, a Tanzania, that are all hosting large numbers of refugees, really don't have the resources. And so what we can do in the first instance is help them shelter. And we do that primarily through funding through the UN, but also through other mechanisms to help them shelter those refugees. But you're right. I mean, the way that you alleviate the situation is to resolve conflict so that people can go home. And when it happens, and it's happened, it's not like it's never happened. Kosovo was one where when the conditions were safe and when that conflict ended, within 30 days, 1 million people, I think, went home. It was unbelievable. And they didn't wait for people to tell them it was okay. I think UNHCR at the time, and I'm just poking fun at them, said, we're not ready. We don't have we don't have shelter. It's winter's coming. We don't have schools. And people just said, I'm going home. This is my home. And they ran back across that border as fast as they could, and they put, roofs on their houses, and they remade their country, which is what they wanted to do. And, I think this idea that we have a little bit self-serving sometimes that this is the best country in the world and everybody wants to come here. The first part of that may be true, but the second part of that isn't. People do, like I think as you said with your family, I mean, people want to go home. That's where they have land, that's where they have language, that's where they have culture. And so again, what we can do, I think, as a people, and not just as a government, to help people return, we should, of course, always strive to make that the first solution. But I think it's just unfortunate right now, the way the world exists, that's largely not possible.
Can I jump into that too? So I was really privileged during my career at the State Department to be able to work with lots of humanitarian organizations and NGOs. And there is this great nobility, as I hope all of us would agree, about humanitarian work. Folks who go in after earthquakes or hurricanes or disease outbreaks. But one of the things that I find especially noble about humanitarian workers is they know that their full effort will only solve problems in a small way. And what they count on is that other people, including diplomats and other development agencies, things like that, will be trying to make the world a place where the root causes don't result in destruction and war and flight, but the root causes facilitate healthy societies that can take care of themselves and don't produce refugees. So it's one of the, I love both of these guys to death, and one of the reasons I find humanitarians so inspiring is because they work on difficult things and hope that other people are fixing the things under their control too.
So we have time for one more quick question.
Hi, I'm Kitty Wang with NTD-TV. My question is, as we know that the administration is trying to thinking about shrinking the number of refugees it's going to accept in the next year, then will that maybe affect the criteria that you use to evaluate those refugees who are most vulnerable, or maybe it could be a potential threat to the national security and so on?
Good question. I mean, first of all, the discussions haven't completed yet for what the structure of the program next year will look like. I think I can say in broad terms that the program, the fundamental values of the program, I don't think will change. I mean, that we're still going to look at vulnerability, we're going to look at assimilation. That's clearly been talked about within the administration. We're going to look at how we use this as a foreign policy tool, which means how do we help some of our key allies by using this program strategically. But I don't think we'll see, I mean, the numbers will diminish. We know that now because last year we brought in 85,000, and this year the president was very clear that we should limit our program to 50,000. So we know that the number overall will diminish, but I think the values of this program won't fundamentally change. I mean, I think it's probably maybe a good way to tie it back up to the Heritage Foundation report where we know there are issues and parts of the program that can be bolstered and can be strengthened and can be examined. And so that will continue. And so assimilation definitely, how we work with communities in the U.S., how we work overseas to vet refugees on a security basis, all of those will continue to be examined, and we will look for ways that we can strengthen them. But I really do think the core values of this program will remain, really between humanitarian response and foreign policy goals.
Great. Well, thanks very much, everyone. Thank you all for coming. That brings us to the end of our time, unfortunately, but please join me in thanking our panelists here.